There's a document sitting inside a museum in Turin, Italy, that the world's most powerful academic institutions have quietly studied for over 2 centuries and never fully explained. It is not a myth. It is not a religious text. It is an official administrative record written by Egyptian scribes, listing the names and reign lengths of every ruler who ever governed the land of Egypt. And buried inside that list, before the names of any human pharaoh, are the names of gods, demigods, and beings who reportedly ruled for tens of thousands of years. The Egyptian priests did not call them legends. They called them kings. What would it mean if the story of human civilization that you were taught in school, the one that begins neatly with Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt around 5,000 years ago, was not the beginning at all? What if it was simply the most recent chapter in a story that goes back further than anyone in a position of authority is willing to admit? Not because the evidence does not exist, but because the evidence is so overwhelming, so structurally incompatible with everything modern academia has built its reputation on, that acknowledging it would require dismantling the entire framework of how we understand our own origins. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a question that serious archaeologists, geologists, and historians are asking right now, in peer-reviewed journals, in international research conferences, and in excavation sites from Turkey to Egypt to the submerged shelves of the Atlantic. And yet, somehow, none of this has made it into mainstream conversation with the urgency it deserves. So let us talk about it the way it actually deserves to be talked about. Not as speculation, not as mythology, not as fringe entertainment, but as the most important historical investigation of our time. The Turin King List, preserved today in the Museo Egizio in Turin, Italy, is a papyrus document written during the reign of Pharaoh Rameses II, approximately 1279 BCE. It was not carved onto a temple wall to glorify a single ruling dynasty. It was not made for public display or political propaganda. It was, by all scholarly understanding, an administrative document, a bureaucratic king list compiled from earlier temple archives, tax records, and royal decrees. The Egyptians treated it the way a modern government might treat a census record. Factual, functional, comprehensive. What makes this document extraordinary, what makes it arguably the most dangerous piece of ancient writing on earth, is what it contains before the names of any human ruler. The first 2 columns of the Turin King List do not begin with Pharaoh Menes, who is traditionally regarded as the founder of the first dynasty of Egypt. They begin with something else entirely. They begin with gods, then demigods, then a category of beings described in the original hieratic script as spirits or shades. And together, these pre-human rulers are assigned reign lengths so vast that they do not fit within any conventional framework of recorded history. The final 2 lines of that column, summarized by the scribe himself, read as follows. Venerables Shemsu-Hor, 13,220 years. Reigns before the Shemsu-Hor, 23,200 years. Total, 36,620 years. Read that again. 36,620 years. That is not a rounding error. That is not metaphorical poetry. That is a scribal summary written in the same administrative format used to record the reign of every human pharaoh on the same document. The Egyptians themselves are telling us, in precise numerical terms, that beings governed their land for over 36 millennia before the first mortal king sat on a throne. And the Egyptian priests, men who were educated in the deepest scribal traditions of their civilization, who had access to every archive, every temple record, every account passed down through generations, did not describe these pre-human rulers as myths. They described them as historical predecessors. But here is where it gets worse. The Turin Papyrus is not alone. The Palermo stone, a fragment of black basalt believed to date to the 5th dynasty of ancient Egypt, around 2500 BCE, records the names and reign lengths of pre-dynastic rulers who governed Egypt before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under a single pharaoh. These rulers existed outside the boundaries of what modern archaeology considers the beginning of Egyptian civilization. The Palermo stone does not apologize for this. It does not label these rulers as legendary. It places them in the same chronological register as fully documented historical figures, assigns them precise reign lengths, and moves on as though this is simply the natural order of events. Then there is Manetho, an Egyptian priest and historian who lived during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus around 280 BCE. Manetho compiled a history of Egypt for the new Greek rulers who had inherited the kingdom after Alexander the Great. Manetho had access to temple archives that no longer exist. He had the scribal education of the old traditions. And in his History of Egypt, fragments of which survive through later historians like Flavius Josephus and Julius Africanus, Manetho describes a pre-human epoch of divine and semi-divine rule lasting thousands of years before the first mortal king. He calls the first fully human king of Egypt Mena, or Menes, and places his rule at approximately 4400 BCE. Before that, in Manetho's account, the land belonged to others. Think about what that means. Three entirely separate ancient Egyptian sources, the Turin King List, the Palermo Stone, and the writings of Manetho, all independently describe the same basic historical architecture, an immense epoch of pre-human or superhuman governance that predated the Egypt we recognize from history books. These sources were compiled at different times by different people using different archives, and they all agree on the fundamental shape of the story. Now, the mainstream academic response to this has always been predictable. These are mythological traditions, the scholars say. The Egyptians were not doing history when they described the reign of gods. They were doing theology. They were constructing a cosmological narrative to legitimize their pharaohs by connecting them to the divine. And that explanation has worked well enough for decades because it allows the academic establishment to maintain its preferred timeline of human civilization, one that begins cleanly around 3100 BCE with the unification of Egypt, with no inconvenient gaps, no unexplained predecessors, no civilizational dark matter lurking in the archaeological record. The problem is that the archaeology is no longer cooperating with that explanation. In southeastern Turkey, on a windscraped ridge in the mountains above what is now the city of Şanlıurfa, there's a site called Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish, it translates roughly to Belly Hill. It is one of the most quietly revolutionary discoveries in the history of human archaeology, and it has been systematically under-discussed in public education for decades. Göbekli Tepe was first noticed in the 1960s during an agricultural survey. Researchers at the time saw large stones embedded in the hillside and recorded them as Byzantine-era grave markers. The site was noted, filed, and forgotten. Then, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt visited the site and realized immediately that something was profoundly wrong with that classification. These were not grave markers. They were the tops of massive T-shaped limestone columns, some of them weighing up to 20 tons, carved with extraordinary precision and covered in intricate relief carvings of animals and abstract symbols. Schmidt began excavating the following year, and what he uncovered over the next 2 decades permanently destabilized everything archaeologists thought they knew about when civilization began. Göbekli Tepe has been reliably dated to approximately 9500 BCE. That makes it more than 11,000 years old. It predates the pyramids of Giza by over 6,000 years. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the invention of writing by 5,000 years. It predates, by every conventional measure, the moment at which human beings were supposed to be capable of building anything remotely like this. According to the narrative that dominated archaeology for generations, the people alive during the construction of Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers, nomadic, technologically primitive, incapable of the organizational complexity required to quarry, transport, shape, and erect multi-ton stone columns in geometric formations according to what appears to be a deliberate cosmological plan. And yet, Göbekli Tepe exists. It is not a hypothesis. It is not a theory. It is a real place you can visit, stand inside, and run your hands across the perfectly carved surfaces of pillars that were hewn from bedrock before a single city existed anywhere on Earth. And since Schmidt's initial excavations, the discoveries have only deepened the mystery. Recent excavations at the site have uncovered evidence of a cistern, permanent housing structures, and grain processing tools, suggesting that this was not simply a ritual gathering place visited seasonally by wandering bands of hunters, but a fully established settlement with permanent occupation, a community, a society, something that looks structurally like the foundation of a civilization. But here's the question that mainstream archaeology has never satisfactorily answered. Where did the builders of Göbekli Tepe come from? What was their social structure? What was their political organization? What accumulated body of knowledge allowed them to plan, coordinate, and execute a construction project of this scale and sophistication? You do not wake up one morning as a hunter-gatherer and suddenly carve a 20-ton pillar into the shape of an abstract astronomical symbol. Skills like that are inherited. They're transmitted. They come from somewhere. And if they come from somewhere, then there was a somewhere to come from. A prior cultural tradition, a prior civilization, a prior world that possessed and passed on this knowledge before the people of Göbekli Tepe ever set chisel to stone. This is not a fringe argument. This is the logical consequence of accepting the archaeological evidence at face value. And it points directly at one of the most disturbing possibilities in the entire history of human inquiry, that there were advanced civilizations on this planet long before the ones we have names for, and that something happened, something catastrophic, something total, that erased them from the physical record, leaving only fragments, echoes, and the stories that Egyptian priests wrote down in administrative papyri and called the reign of the gods. And what that something was, the geological record may finally be revealing. Around 12,800 years ago, Earth was in the middle of a warming trend. The last great ice age was ending, ice sheets were retreating, sea levels were rising. The planet was thawing at a rate that should have continued steadily for thousands of years. Then, within what appears to have been a matter of decades, perhaps less, global temperatures plummeted, not gradually, not incrementally, catastrophically. The Earth plunged back into near glacial conditions for approximately 200 years. This period is called the Younger Dryas, and for a long time, scientists could not fully explain what caused it. The warming had been interrupted by something, but what? In 2007, a group of geologists and researchers put forward a hypothesis that the scientific community immediately found uncomfortable. They proposed that a massive comet or asteroid, fragmenting as it entered Earth's atmosphere, had exploded above the North American ice sheet approximately 12,800 years ago, triggering a cascade of catastrophic consequences. Widespread continental fires, a massive pulse of meltwater from destabilized ice sheets flooding into the North Atlantic, a disruption of ocean circulation patterns, and ultimately an impact winter that drove global temperatures back down for over a millennium. This became known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And since it was first proposed, the evidence supporting it has not weakened. It has grown. By 2024, researchers publishing in peer-reviewed journals had documented a 62-mile-wide comet explosion event, timed precisely to the onset of the Younger Dryas. In 2025, studies identified shocked quartz, a geological signature that can only be produced by extreme cosmic impact pressures at multiple sites across North America, dated precisely to the Younger Dryas boundary. Platinum group metals, nanodiamonds, melted glass materials, and a continental scale biomass burning spike have now been found at approximately 30 sites across 4 continents: North America, Europe, the Middle East, and South America. The same geochemical fingerprint at the same geological layer on opposite sides of the planet. What that means, if you follow the physics of the event, is genuinely staggering to contemplate. A fragmenting comet explodes over North America. The heat and shockwave are incomprehensible in scale. Continental fires ignite across millions of square miles. The smoke, soot, and particulate matter ejected into the upper atmosphere block sunlight for years. The planet cools. The ice sheets, already weakened by the warming trend, are shock destabilized, releasing tsunamis of meltwater into the oceans. Sea levels surge. Coastlines that had been above water for thousands of years, the vast habitable continental shelves that extend from every landmass on Earth, are swallowed by the rising ocean, and they stay submerged. They are still submerged today. Here is what most people are not seeing in this picture. At the peak of the last ice age, approximately 20,000 years ago, global sea levels were roughly 400 feet lower than they are today. That means hundreds of millions of square miles of land that are currently underwater were, at that time, above the surface. This is not speculation, it is geological fact. The continental shelves of every major landmass, the areas stretching outward from the current coastlines for miles and miles into what we now call the sea, were dry, inhabitable, temperate land. And if there were civilizations flourishing before the Younger Dryas impact event, the most logical place to look for their ruins is not in the deserts or the mountains. It is underwater, in the submerged continental shelves that were drowned when the ice melted and the seas rose, a process that accelerated dramatically in the centuries following the Younger Dryas cooling event. What this means is devastating for conventional archaeology. Every survey we have done of ancient human habitation has been conducted on land. We have dug in the soil, excavated the hills, mapped the deserts and the river valleys, and on that basis, we have drawn our maps of human history. But if the most advanced societies of the pre-Younger Dryas world lived on coastal plains that are now 40 to 400 feet beneath the surface of the ocean, then we have been looking in the wrong places. We have been drawing conclusions from an incomplete data set, systematically missing the part of the record that got flooded. And then we have had the intellectual arrogance to declare that our incomplete picture is the complete picture. The Egyptian records begin to look very different when you hold this possibility in front of them. When the Turin king list describes beings who ruled Egypt for 36,120 years before the first human pharaoh, the instinct is to dismiss it as myth. But consider the timeline. The Younger Dryas impact event occurred approximately 12,800 years ago. If you count backward 36,620 years from the reign of the first human Egyptian pharaoh at around 3100 BCE, you arrive at approximately 39,000 BCE. That is deep in the Paleolithic. That is a period during which modern Homo sapiens were unquestionably present on Earth. And that is a period during which the coastal landscapes of the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, the entire geographic theater of what we call the ancient world, looked nothing like what they look like today. The sea was hundreds of feet lower, the land was vastly wider. The civilizational stage, if civilizations existed, was a completely different shape than the one we know. Now add to this the work of researchers who have spent the last several years mapping the astronomical alignments encoded into Göbekli Tepe. In 2023, researchers reanalyzed the famous Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe, known as the Vulture Stone, and dated its encoded celestial configuration to approximately 10,950 BCE, with a margin of 250 years. That date is not random. It corresponds almost exactly to the onset of the Younger Dryas. The builders of Göbekli Tepe appear to have recorded a comet impact event in stone, not as metaphor, not as myth, as a precise astronomical record, encoded in the only medium they trusted to survive, rock. And then, approximately 1,000 years later, they buried the entire site deliberately. Every circle, every pillar, every carving, they filled it in with rubble and covered it over, not because it was destroyed, because they chose to bury it, as though they were placing something in safekeeping, as though they expected that the world was changing, that whatever came next might not have the capacity to understand what they had built, and so the best thing they could do was seal it away and let the earth preserve it, until the future people could dig it out and read it. Is that not exactly what happened? 11,000 years later, Klaus Schmidt found it under the soil and changed human history. Whoever buried Göbekli Tepe preserved it perfectly. And the question of why they buried it, the question of what they knew was coming, sits at the center of this entire investigation like a code that has not yet been fully cracked. Because Göbekli Tepe is not the only anomaly, it is simply the most famous. Across the world, in the years since Schmidt's initial discovery, archaeologists have been quietly uncovering sites that push the boundaries of the conventional timeline further and further back. Underwater survey work off the coasts of India has located submerged stone structures dated to before 9500 BCE. Structures on the floor of the North Sea, in an area that researchers call Doggerland, preserve evidence of a vast inhabitable plain that was above water until approximately 8000 BCE, a landscape that once supported significant human populations, now completely hidden beneath the sea. Submerged sites have been identified off the coast of Cuba, in the Aegean, in the Persian Gulf, in areas of the Pacific. Everywhere the continental shelves are mapped with modern sonar, the underwater archaeology suggests that human civilization's footprint was significantly larger, more widely distributed, and more anciently established than the textbooks acknowledge. What the mainstream narrative has done with this accumulating body of evidence is revealing. It has not been ignored entirely. That would be impossible. The evidence is physical, measurable, peer-reviewed. Instead, each individual discovery has been categorized, compartmentalized, and absorbed into the existing framework with minimal disruption to the overall story. This site is an anomaly. That date is a statistical outlier. These structures were built by a more sophisticated version of the cultures we already know about. The framework absorbs the anomalies one by one, and the story stays intact. Because changing the story would mean changing everything. The textbooks, the museum exhibits, the funding structures of dozens of academic fields, the professional reputations of generations of scholars who built their careers on the existing timeline. This is not cynicism. This is institutional behavior. It is predictable. It is human. And it is not unique to archaeology. But the cost of it is that an entire chapter of human history, possibly the most important chapter, the one that explains where we actually come from, is being processed through academic machinery too slow and too conservative to keep up with the evidence. Here is the picture that the evidence now appears to be drawing. Somewhere in the period between 40,000 and 15,000 years ago, during an epoch we have barely begun to investigate, human civilization reached a level of sophistication that left physical evidence in stone, in astronomical alignment, in administrative records kept by ancient priests, and in geological signatures buried in ice cores and lake sediments on 4 continents. Then, approximately 12,800 years ago, a catastrophic cosmic event, a fragmenting comet impacting a warming Earth at a moment of maximum geological vulnerability, triggered a cascade of consequences that reset the physical landscape of the planet. Fires, floods, a rapid climate reversal, rising seas that swallowed coastlines in decades, a civilizational dark age lasting over a millennium, during which whatever had been built was either destroyed, submerged, or reduced to scattered survivors who carried fragments of the old knowledge in their minds and their myths. And when those survivors rebuilt, when the climate stabilized, when the floods receded, when the earth warmed again and humanity began once more to organize itself into communities, into agriculture, into cities, they built on the bones of what had come before. They built in places like Göbekli Tepe, encoding what they remembered into stone because they understood that stone survives. They built in the Nile Valley, where the conditions for civilization had always been favorable, and their priests kept lists, careful, precise, administrative lists, of everything that had come before, including the epics of divine and semi-divine rulers who had governed in the age before the catastrophe. They did not call those rulers myths. They called them ancestors. And 5,000 years after that, an Italian diplomat named Bernardino Drovetti found that papyrus in Egypt in 1822 transported it to Turin, and accidentally crumbled it into fragments during the journey. Scholars have been painstakingly piecing it back together ever since. As of today, the reconstruction is still incomplete. There are fragments that have not yet been definitively placed. There are lines that are damaged beyond legibility. There are portions of the list, possibly the most critical portions, the ones describing the earliest epochs in the most detail, that are simply missing. What most people are not seeing is that the incompleteness of the Turin King list is not a reason to dismiss it. It is a reason to take it more seriously, because what we can read, the portions that are intact, the numbers that are legible, the administrative categories that survived, already tells us more than our current civilizational narrative can comfortably accommodate. And the portions we cannot read, the sections lost to time and careless handling in the 19th century, may have contained exactly the details that would have made the picture undeniable. Think about what that means. The most important historical document about humanity's deep past was found, crumbled in transit, and partially reconstructed. What we recovered is already revolutionary. What we lost may have been the proof that changes everything. Now, consider where all of this leaves us. We are, according to the structure of human history as the evidence increasingly suggests it, the sixth civilization. Not the first, not the culmination, not the pinnacle of an unbroken line of upward progress stretching back to the Stone Age. We are the inheritors of a story that has been told and catastrophically interrupted at least once, and possibly more than once, before us. We are the people who dug up Göbekli Tepe and found it already buried. We are the people who read the Turin King list and called it mythology because we could not fit it into the framework we had already decided was true. We are the civilization that built its entire self-understanding on the assumption that we are the beginning, when the Egyptian priests, the most meticulous record keepers the ancient world ever produced, were quietly telling us, in hieratic script on a repurposed tax roll, that we are not. The question that no institution is fully answering is this: what ended the civilizations before us? The geological record offers an answer that is increasingly hard to dismiss: a comet, a flood, a catastrophic reset that buried coastlines and memories alike. But if that answer is correct, then a follow-on question emerges that is arguably more urgent than the historical mystery. If it happened before, if civilizations that left no trace in our textbooks were erased by a single cosmic event, what is the probability that it cannot happen again? The torrid meteor stream, the diffuse trail of debris from the comet system that researchers associate with the Younger Dryas impact, still crosses Earth's orbital path. The same researchers who documented the Younger Dryas impact evidence have identified what they call a resonant swarm within that stream, a concentration of material that our planet encounters periodically. The timescales are not geological. They are not millions of years. They are thousands of years. And we are, by some researchers' calculations, within a window in which that encounter becomes more probable than it has been for a very long time. The civilization before us did not see it coming. Or perhaps they did. And what they left behind in the astronomical carvings of Göbekli Tepe, in the lists of the Turin Papyrus, in the flood myths that appear independently in virtually every ancient culture on Earth, from Mesopotamia to the Americas to South Asia, was not mythology. It was a warning, a message encoded in the most durable medium available, aimed at whoever came next, saying, "This happened. This is what it looked like. We were here before you. And we did not survive. Whether we are different from them is not a question that history can answer. It is a question we are still writing. But the fact that the sixth civilization, us, has spent the last 2 centuries systematically categorizing that warning as mythology rather than information says something about us that we may want to examine very carefully. Because the Turin King list is sitting in a museum in Turin. The nanodiamonds are in the geological record. Göbekli Tepe is above the ground and open to the sky. The evidence is not hidden. It never was. What has been missing is not the evidence. What has been missing is the willingness to let the evidence mean what it actually means. That we are not the first, that the story did not start with us, that the gods of ancient Egypt were recorded not as divine fantasy, but as historical memory, and that somewhere beneath 400 feet of ocean water, on the sunken continental shelves that once held the coastlines of a different world, the ruins of civilizations we have not yet named are waiting in the dark, perfectly preserved, for the moment when we are finally ready to look. Whether that moment comes before the next catastrophe or after it is the only question that matters now.